noalprs.org, you will see a very rough site that has just been spun up, but it does have a little bit of information about how you can try to get more involved in the coalition effort. Yeah, so that is a little bit about us, and as I said, the main programming is these meetups. Next Tuesday, we're going to have Rachel Stuckey, who is the artistic director at MOA, the Museum of Human Achievement here in Austin. They're one of our best alternative performing arts venues, and she's the director of their digital arts program there. So she's going to be talking to us about some of their work and stuff. So yeah, you should definitely come for that, either in person or online. So, oh, and then finally, I have one final announcement I want to make, which is there was actually, for a long time, EFF Austin was the only EFA group, not only in Austin, but actually in all of Texas, which is weird because there, as I told you, there's about 100 of them all throughout the United States. So it was a lot of ground for just us to cover. There's now actually 2 EFA groups in Texas, both in Austin. Our longtime friends at Open Austin are recent members of the EFA as well. I'm going to give you a plug for their next event that their director, Leonie, asked me to give you all, which is to invite you all to their 2025 Ice Cream Social. That is going to be July 17th at Jenny's at the Triangle from 4 to 7 p.m. If you're especially someone who has programming skills and wants to get interested in civic activism to try to leverage government data sets and improve citizens' lives, that's their bread and butter and what they do. They're great people. We encourage you to go out to their social and get more involved with them, just like we encourage you to get more involved with us if you believe in these things. So anyway, without further ado, I am going to introduce our speaker, who we always get such cool speakers, but especially given who we are as EFF Austin, we are honored to be joined by Cindy Cohn. So Cindy Cohn is the current executive director of the Electronic Frontier Foundation. From 2000 to 2015, she served as EFF's legal director as well as its general counsel. She first became involved with EFF in 1993 when EFF asked her to serve as the outside lead attorney in Bernstein v. Department of Justice, the successful First Amendment challenge to the U.S. export restrictions on cryptography. And I'm sure Cindy will probably get very embarrassed if I keep reading her, frankly, incredibly impressive accolades. She's like literally been named one of the top 50 women in tech, one of the top lawyers in America, an enormous list of accolades, and in my opinion, very well deserved. She's also the host of the award-winning podcast, How to Fix the Internet. So anyway, her initial claim to fame there and how she got to EFF is actually what inspired me to ask her to give us a talk, which is, for those who maybe are new to the privacy movement and haven't really thought about a lot of the interesting legal places that code and law intersect, so essentially, code is actually covered by the First Amendment. It is a free speech issue. But you might wonder, well, somebody had to settle that. And actually, that case I just alluded to you was one of the foundational constitutional law cases about establishing that the code you write is your voice, your speech, and it's protected by the First Amendment. And, we haven't actually had a talk digging into the depth of that and the implications of that. And who better than the person who successfully argued before the Supreme Court that that is how the law should view computer code. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Cindy to tell us about that monumental case, and just what happened, and how we now live in a world where things like cryptography and encryption are legally safe because of that case. So yeah, without further ado, take it away, Cindy.
Oh, thank you so much. I love talking about this case. It was sure a lot of fun. And I do think it set up a lot of the things that we kind of take for granted today, but also the work we still have to do to keep people secure and private online. So if you're, as you mentioned, in 1993, I got a call from one of EFF's founders, John Gilmore, who I knew a little socially, and he said, do you know how to do a lawsuit? And I was 3 years out of law school, and I said, sure, I know how to do a lawsuit. And he said, well, there's a math PhD student at UC Berkeley, and he's written a computer program, and he wants to publish it on the internet. But if he does, the government says he'll go to jail as an arms dealer. And I said, well, what does it do? Does it blow things up? And he said, no, it keeps things secret. And I said, well, that sounds like a First Amendment problem to me. And he said, we think so too. Will you take the case? And sure enough, I was able to convince my little law firm to let me take the case. I think I literally told them, I think this internet thing is going to be big and it would be good for us to get in on the ground floor, which turned out to be true, although in a very different way than I think the firm thought. But so I represented Daniel J. Bernstein, who was a PhD student at UC Berkeley, and we challenged what was then stopping the development of strong encryption for online activities. And at the time, strong encryption was controlled under the U.S. export regulations. It was on something called the U.S. munitions list. And this is a list of things that you cannot export from the United States unless you have a license from the government. It contains things like tanks and surface-to-air missiles and, other military style equipment, mainly. But on that list was software with the capability of maintaining secrecy. And so that's why the math student trying to publish their code that had the capability of maintaining secrecy required a license from the U.S. government, and the government did not give licenses for strong encryption. So that's kind of the context in which we took the case, which I took the case. And so we had to find a way to think about what was wrong with these export regulations and what were the best ways to deal and to try to get a court. And remember, this is 1994. This is before the World Wide Web was available to the public. The internet was still largely the province of universities and governments at a very small level. So we knew we were going to have to convince a federal judge to let our client export, publish this information. And so, we started thinking about the best way to do that. And of course, we started with the fundamentals of what happens when you do something online, when you publish it, right? This is why this sounded like a First Amendment problem to me. Why can't you publish your scientific ideas online? Because code is a way to express scientific ideas, and it's especially good at expressing scientific ideas about how to do something, right? Processes. It's more like recipes in some ways. Code can be more like a recipe than maybe like pure knowledge, of other kinds. But it's a science. Computer code is, let's put it this way. I started talking to people who were involved in computer science at a bunch of levels and trying to think about how to develop out this argument. One of the people who I talked to is a professor named Harold Abelson. Hal Abelson is a pretty storied professor at MIT Press. MIT Press, my brain. MIT. I have a book coming out with MIT Press, so in my brain it got crossed here. It looks like John has some suggestion for you, Kevin. Maybe turn off one of the mics in that room.
Well, there are two mics. Maybe that is some of the issue.
That's what John is thinking. So I figured.
Yeah, it should be combined to the same system.
Turn one on. Yeah.
Yeah, they're linked.
So anyway, we started thinking.
Okay, the stereo. We have to have both of them. Okay.
Oh, okay.
You just keep going. As I said,
Okay.
This is our problem.
So we started putting the case together, and we decided that the best way to get the court to understand this was to really lean into the fact that computer code is a language. And is one of the things that Professor Abelson taught me is that code must be written in a way that other humans can understand, and only incidentally for a computer to understand. Because code is a language by which certain kinds of ideas are communicated. So we had him write a declaration. We had a whole bunch of people write declarations about how the internet was becoming a place where scientists exchanged information and shared information. The scientific process happened, and how publishing computer code was part of that process. Now that didn't mean that the government couldn't regulate it, but it put it in a category of speech, because scientific speech is speech, because sometimes people think about free speech and they think about political speech or cultural speech or other kinds of things, but scientific speech has always been part of speech. So we wanted to put publishing computer code into the box of scientific speech and publishing in the scientific method, because, first of all, because that's true, that's actually what was going on, and that's why Dan Bernstein, now Professor Bernstein, wanted to publish his code, was to be part of this scientific process. And so that should be protected by the First Amendment, and it should be protected at the highest level of the First Amendment, which means if the government wants to regulate it, it has to meet a very high bar in order to do so. So we put together a bunch of experts in the internet and in cryptography and in science, and we had them explain to the judge why what the government was doing was interfering with the scientific development of the science of cryptography. So it's not just code, and so code is speech, and cryptography is science. And so we argued on both of these sides that the government preventing people from publishing code was interfering with the development of science, and we won. The court agreed with this, that computer code is speech, which is everybody says code is speech now, and that the government's particular kind of regulation where you had to get a license before you could publish it is something that the law calls a prior restraint on speech. And this is an area where the courts are especially nervous about regulation that requires you to go kind of on bended knee to a bureaucrat to get a license in order to publish your speech, which is how the export licenses worked. That this kind of thing, this kind of prior restraint is really problematic, not just because they say no, but because the process of having to go in and ask itself chills a lot of speech. People just won't go do that at the level that we want in a free society where we want science to develop and people who aren't, you know, rich corporate players to be able to participate in science. So we brought the case here in the Northern District of California, where I am, and we won. There were a lot of twists and turns along the way, including the government, including the government shifting the kind of regulation from the Bureau of Export Administration, which is in the State Department, over to the Commerce Department in the middle of us winning. So we had to start over and do it all over again, but then the court agreed with us that the Commerce Department licensing scheme wasn't any better than the State Department licensing scheme. So we won in the district court, and we went up to the Court of Appeals, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. The government was in the process of appealing it further, something called en banc review in the Ninth Circuit. In like 1999, this was when Al Gore was getting ready to run for president against G.W. Bush. Gore really wanted the Silicon Valley, the tech vote, and so in part because we were winning, and in part because of the politics of the moment, the government backed down after we won at the Ninth Circuit, and while the thing was still in play. They reissued regulations that got rid of the requirement that you had to ask for a license first. Today, if you want to publish strong encryption code, you have to send a copy to the government at the time that you publish it, but you don't have any other real requirements for non-commercial code. For commercial code, there's a couple more hoops, but it's far less than it was. And the government really doesn't get in the way of strong encryption anymore as a result of that. The sad part from a legal part is that our beautiful citable Ninth Circuit precedent got taken away because the government was seeking further review when it backed down. But the good news is that there was a parallel case that was happening out of Cleveland that we did get a publishable opinion out of it, that code was speech and the export restrictions violated the First Amendment in the Fifth Circuit. And so we still have very good law, we just don't have my law, which makes me a little annoying. But what we were able to do with this was really level the playing field. We were able to create a broad understanding that code is speech, which means the government has to meet a very high bar. It doesn't mean they can't regulate it, but it has to meet a very high bar, and in a very limited circumstance can the government regulates speech. A lot of the questions about where that regulation sits is some of it has been played out in some other situations involving code, and it's still kind of, well, the fact that code to speech has not been undone. What level of scrutiny, depending on why the government is regulating, is still a little bit in flux in different situations. There's some cryptography, there's some cryptocurrency, and crypto cases are like this. There's actually a case out of Texas about 3D printed guns that addresses some of these issues as well. And there's some cases involving copyright and the Digital Millennium Copyright Act that address it as well in different sectors. But getting code into the box of speech was a tremendous step forward for general freedom for people to be able to write what they want and to code different things online. And then recognizing that science was happening on the internet and the internet needed to be protected as a matter of First Amendment for this scientific purpose was something that we really nailed down with the case as well. Now, fast forward now, this was 1999 when we won this ruling, and so we were like, hooray, we won the crypto wars. Well, we've learned a few things since then. In the Snowden revelations, we learned that the government was secretly going to talk to creators of cryptographic software and trying to get them to build in backdoors and undermine the strength of it. This is one of the Snowden revelations, which was infuriating, that having lost in the courts the ability to dumb down our encryption or to leave us without encryption, the government was trying to go through the back doors to make that happen. And the front door attacks haven't stopped right now. There is the UK just passed a law that is threatening to make anybody who carries messages on behalf of others be able to access the plain text of those messages, which means you can't offer strong end-to-end encryption to those things. The Australian government has passed a similar rule, and we continue to see versions of this in the United States that EFF has been able to bat down over the years. It turns out law enforcement really doesn't want you to have any privacy. It's kind of a ridiculous argument if you ask me. I think, if the police came to your front door and said, look, there are burglars about, so what we want you to do is leave your back door open, so in case you're a burglar, we can get into your house and find, whatever you've hidden in there. Most people would think that was crazy and no way to go about law enforcement, but yet when essentially the same thing gets floated as, well, we want to make sure that nobody is able to do encryption that's warrant proof, where they can't get to the plain text of your communications and they want it. That doesn't make us more safe. It makes us less safe, because if they build back doors in, it's not just the good guys who are going to be able to use it. Nobody's ever built a back door into a computer system or a house that's only available to be used by good guys and not able to be used by bad guys. And this is an area where the offline world and the online world are perfectly parallel, and the government's position is, I think, ill-advised in both. So this is that's the Bernstein case. We were successful, but the fight goes on, and we continue to have to stand up for strong encryption in a lot of different places, both in the United States and around the world. But we set the floor, we set the ground rules in a very good place that leaves us in a strong place to fight off all future attacks. I'm happy to talk further, but I wanted to pause and see if people had any questions or things. I'm the executive director of EFF, and so I'm kind of a mile wide and an inch deep about the other things we do as well, if people want to ask about that. And by the way, this is July 8th. July 10th is our 35th anniversary at EFF. It's crazy, huh? We're the biggest and the oldest. Thursday at noon, or 11 o'clock our time, so that'll be 1 o'clock for you guys in Texas. Kind of reflecting on the 35 years and having a couple staffers and a board member kind of talk about that if you want to tune in.
Well, that's all really awesome. I will say that we're still, my understanding is we still have really bad audio on the stream, and if it's a bitrate issue, I can't fix that while we're live, so I went with recommended settings. But we do have some closed captions I figured out how to turn on, so hopefully those of you out there remotely at least are sort of following along now. I tested this extensively. I do not know what is going on. I will keep investigating, but hopefully this at least is letting you start to hear now with the subtitles. Yes, I would love to get questions from both the room and anybody online who thanks to the captions is now able to actually follow along. Yeah, got a question.
I'm curious to know, not sure if I missed it when you addressed this, but like, what were the government's like counter arguments in court about like why they wanted encryption software, how they argued that it's basically military hardware?
Yeah, I mean, I think they started from, this is a military issue, it's a military decision, so courts ought to stay out of it, right? We're seeing a lot of echoes of that now in a lot of the stuff the Trump administration is saying, this is about national security, so the court should butt out. Then, kind of on the merits of it, they basically argued, I mean, to a certain extent, like, I understand a little bit where they were coming from, right? If you know the history, like, our ability to break the German encryption, with the Enigma machine and also the Japanese encryption, is, widely cited to be one of the reasons we won World War II, right? Cryptography has always been a tool of the military. Caesar had a cipher, right? But it's also just never been entirely theirs. But I think they came at it from this perspective. This has always been a military tool. It's incredibly important that our military be able to break anybody's encryption around the world. So these export restrictions are just trying to continue that thing that helped us win the war before. And it's national security, and courts should butt out when it's national security. And then I think another strain of argument that they made was, you're talking about the code as speech, but the code is functional. We're not regulating the code because of what it says. We're regulating the code because of what it does. We're not trying, our aim is not to stop scientists from talking about code. That's just a side effect of us trying to make sure that the, scary bad guy of the day, which in the 90s might have been, I don't know, the Russians or something, the Soviet Union, the Russians, don't get it. So, all this scientific argument, this is just a side effect of what we're doing, and what we're doing is legit, which is we're trying to keep our adversaries from having access to it. Our arguments and the court's arguments were like, well, you don't get to, I guess on the first issue that, well, yes, it may have been a military issue, but it's never been only a military issue. Like, real people need cryptography, and as the world becomes digital, they're going to need it more and more. But there's actually historical, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams used a cipher that Thomas Jefferson developed in order to communicate, during the time of the Revolution. So it's not always militaries that have needed encryption anyway, if you look at the history. And as we were moving into the digital era, cryptography is one of the ways that we can have security online, and as more and more people got online and got into this digital future, more and more people were going to use it. So even if it was your little play toy military, it can't be anymore. Was one of our, the court was more polite than that, but they definitely recognized that the coming digital revolution meant that people were going to need security, and that cryptography was really one of the only tools, and one of the best tools to be able to give people security in the digital world. And as to the functionality, the courts basically said, like, that's never been the test. Recipes are protected speech even if you could build a cake. Even though they're useful. Science has always been protected under the First Amendment, even though learning science can help you do things that are useful. And the court basically said, it can't be that I think that one of the quotes was the admixture of functionality can't deprive speech of its protection under the First Amendment. And actually, I just was rereading one of the decisions, and the court was kind of prescient. She said, our judge in the Ninth Circuit was Betty Fletcher, who wrote the lead opinion, and she said, we're coming into a time when people are gonna be able to speak to computers, using their voice, actually speak to computers. It can't be the case that the minute a computer can understand and act based on what we say, that our speech loses the protection of the First Amendment. Like that just can't be the answer. And the same is, the speaking to the computer is the one that's kind of really obvious, because we think of speech as, literally the speech part. But the same has to be true for written information. That it can't be that we remove the First Amendment protection when somebody can do something with what we say. So those were kind of their two kind of couple of separate arguments. The functionality argument and the this is the military's purview argument were two of them. And then there was a bunch of technical arguments about the export restrictions and administrative review and stuff like that. But those were really the two arguments that were kind of more substantive.
Thank you.
Awesome. And also, I just want to let Cindy know, and anybody, I think people online know, I want to let Cindy know, we fixed the audio issues. Blunder on my part, I had our mixer up way too high. Apologies to everyone online. I'm sure I chased a few of you off because I was told it was literal static. Apologies. But it's fixed now, yay. You also have closed captioning, so even more accessibility, yay. But yes, apologies for that. I know some of you didn't get to hear a lot of what Cindy had to say, so I please, anybody who's watching online, if there was really something you were hoping to learn from this presentation, please type in the chat what you would like to learn, because I'm happy to have Cindy. She may end up repeating something she already said, but I think she and I are both happy to do that if you missed a key piece of information. That's the whole reason you tuned in. So once again, as I said, first time we're doing this, dumb mistake on my part. It won't happen next month, so bear with us. Thank you. Yeah, we have more questions for Cindy. Yeah.
Should I move up there?
Yes,
Okay.
because we do want to make sure everybody can hear. And so Cindy can see it.
Hello.
Hi.
So I understand the strategic benefits of protecting code as speech, right? Subjecting it to strict scrutiny provides a level of protection that otherwise wouldn't be available. But what problems do you see, if any, arising from the fact? I'm thinking about the issues that come from like copyright issues in AI generated images as like artistic expression. Do you think there'll be any problems with code as expression or code as speech when artificial intelligence starts creating its own code?
There's some really interesting think pieces here about that, right? I mean, like whose speech is it, right? If the AI is coding, and how do you want to think about that? And I know that I wish I had Corinne McSherry and our IP people here. I mean, first of all, you only get to strict scrutiny for some kinds of regulation of speech. So just to be clear, and in fact, the Supreme Court just threw a wrench in in the Paxton case, just threw a wrench in one of the things that we'd all thought of. But in the context of the other IP cases, like the copyright, the DMCA cases around the anti-circumvention provisions of the DMCA, which were about publishing code that lets you circumvent copyright controls, the court found that only intermediate scrutiny applied. And so the fit between the means and the end of the regulation of like publishing code that lets you circumvent copyright protections, that they passed First Amendment scrutiny. The court agreed with us that it was speech. We handled one of the cases at EFF, but said it doesn't get the highest level. It's not a licensing scheme, so we're out of prior restraint land. And inside the context of the more traditional First Amendment analysis, there's three levels of scrutiny. There's strict scrutiny if they're regulating it based on the content. There's intermediate scrutiny if it's not content-based. And then there's rational basis if it's just a kind of a side effect of something else. Those are the kind of traditional three categories of free speech. And in the context of the DMCA, they said, well, the government isn't targeting that speech based on its content. I actually think that was wrong, but they said they they really are regulating it based upon the thing that it does, which is break copyright encryption. So they found intermediate scrutiny, they found that the regulation passed intermediate scrutiny, and the regulation went forward. So I think when we think about it in the context of, kind of AIs generating code, it really will depend on why the government is regulating it and how close a fit there is between the means and the ends, right? So I think that a regulation that said AI can't write any code because it might infringe copyright, or you have to get a license in order to have AI write code because it might infringe copyright, that's probably too broad. That probably wouldn't pass intermediate scrutiny, right? But if you had something that was very narrow that said, if you're writing code that can solely be used to, pretend like you're, the voice of a famous person or something, I'm kind of crossing a couple of that's not a copyright issue, but, making a Disney movie exact parallel, something like that would probably pass scrutiny. So, I guess I think that the tests we have, while they may not be applied correctly, are still the right way to frame the question, and they force you to look at what is the regulation doing, why is the government doing it, and how close is the fit between what the government can legitimately do and the actual way the rule is written. I think for general purpose AI, and this is what the courts are saying, and this is a kind of a separate question, is that it's hard to find copyright infringement in general purpose AIs. They can spit it out, but in the training of it, it's pretty hard to find copyright infringement. We just had 2 decisions in this in our local Northern District California courts a couple weeks ago, and they both said that. One laid out a pathway for how one might find copyright infringement, which I'm not sure they're going to be able to meet, and the other one said that you just can't. So, but it's not just a copyright issue. Like, I think that when it comes to thinking about AIs and how you regulate AIs, what the First Amendment is going to mean is the government can't do broad, imprecise laws. They're going to have to think hard about how they write the laws and what the consequences might be for those, and make sure that they aren't sweeping too broadly, and that they're actually articulating the fit between the means and the end is really good, and that they're not trying to regulate based on content, they're regulating based on some other problem.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Yeah. It's going to be fun. Lots of work for lawyers.
Lots of work for lawyers, yeah.
For everybody, but, as a lawyer, I think about it. I think that, AI is such an interesting, well, first of all, generative AI is only one piece of AI. And I'm worried that it's sucking all of the air out of thinking about all the other problems that AI causes. The government deciding whether you get to keep your children or not based upon a machine learning model that isn't very good, which I think is it just is getting over. These kinds of problems with real world allocated use of AI by governments right now are getting overlooked because of the sexy Scarlett Johansson stuff, and I just would urge everybody to pay attention to all of it and not get sucked into thinking that AI is all generative AI, because it's not. It doesn't mean it's bad. I'm more worried about other kinds of AI.
I actually have a question from online for you that's a bit of a follow-up here, where somebody's interested in just kind of fair use around copyright in general, since it's obviously raised by generative AI. But as we all know, copyright material can be used for things like fair use. The question is, are there examples where free speech was seen as fair use of copyrighted materials, basically?
Oh, huge numbers of cases, yeah. Some courts have opined that fair use is where free speech lives in the Copyright Act, which I think is kind of backwards, honestly. I think free speech should live apart and copyright should have to yield to it rather than it be a little something. But there's plenty of fair, a couple of the cases, there's a case involving Two Live Crew doing a parody Roy Orbison's Pretty Women, which is a U.S. Supreme Court case, and the U.S. Supreme Court said, you know, parody, which is making fun of something, is one of the reasons that you can, which is protected by the First Amendment, is one of the things that, you know, the fair use doctrine has to cover. So that's why, you know, whether it's Weird Al or anybody else, there is plenty of space for people to make fun of each other using copyrighted works. Weird Al is usually doing satire, not parody, but because he's not making fun of the art, he's making fun of other things using the art. But anyway, so yeah, there's tons of free speech doctrine, a fair use doctrine that's about free speech. Every time you do a criticism, you can use a work in order to criticize it. So anybody who's doing movie reviews, you know, they can use snippets of the movie to talk about, you know, whether the movie was good or bad, what they thought about it, because criticizing a movie is one of the things that you can take pieces of the movie in order to do. That's fair use. Sometimes people make can use the whole thing in order to comment upon it or criticize it or use it. So yeah, there's a ton of law about this, and it's kind of the heartland of fair use, is the idea that when someone's engaging in free speech, fair uses really should kick in, and copyright law shouldn't get in the way.
So I'm going to ask you, I think, a question of mine that I actually think is an interesting follow-up to that, and I think it gets to the heart of, I think, some people's worries around generative AI and how, what the limits of free speech in that context are. Because I think, you know, one thing I've even in arguing about AI regulation here in the state, one thing I very much emphasized is, even in the name of combating, say, deepfakes and deception, we don't want to stop parody. Like, I think we want to be able to use generative AI to portray powerful people doing silly things. It's quite fun. But I think a lot of people worry about, well, what if somebody uses generative AI to make me do horrible things, just an ordinary person, not a public figure, and they put it on the internet, damage my reputation, everybody laugh at me. Is that fair use? Is that free speech? Or have my rights of being turned into somebody else's digital puppet been violated in some way? Where's the line?
I would say the first thing is that this isn't new, right? Photoshop existed before generative AI, and before that there were tons of other ways in which, you know, people can misuse. Now the law starts from a first category, which is, are you a public person, or are you public facing in what you're doing in such a way that you have less ability to stop people from making fun of you or parodying you, so you're a government official or you're somebody like that. The court's going to give a different analysis than if you're just a private person and then some rando takes your, pretends like, takes something and makes something that makes you look like you're doing something that you would not do. There are tort laws about false light, about misrepresenting what somebody does, and all of those things have places in them that make the difference between whether you're a public person who ought to be able to deal with people doing things like the Nancy Pelosi, really weak thing that made her look like he was weak and they were just messing around with it. Nancy Pelosi should have much less ability to shut down that kind of stuff than Kevin Welch or Cindy Cohn. I'm a little more public, but depending on, how and why and where, right? But somebody just randomly taking your vacation video and turning it into something where you look like a pedophile, you already have a lot of legal protections for that, and those will apply whether they use AI or Photoshop or any other thing. There are all sorts of legal protections. Many of them are state laws, not federal, but that's okay. They're still very strong. You can get somebody thrown in jail for that kind of thing. So the tool that people are using shouldn't make much of a difference, and it shouldn't make a difference. Like, what you have to prove is that people reasonably thought that you did this thing. And again, public people have to have a thicker skin in the law than private people. This is something we're seeing a lot of public people fighting back against, right? President Trump really wants to open up the libel laws, and definitely, when he says that, what he means is he wants there to be less space to make fun of him than there would otherwise be even though he's a public person. Whereas private people have always had stronger rights, and if even, you know, some of us are public in one part of their lives and private in another part of their lives. So the law has plenty of already baked in distinctions between those kinds of things that'll turn the answer to a particular thing that might happen to a person into a civil judgment or a criminal prosecution, regardless of the tool. So generative AI shouldn't change any of that. It may make it easier for people to argue that something was so convincing that people really believed it, whereas if, you know, somebody, you know, did a lame Photoshop, they, you know, more people might not be convinced. But again, the doctrine already requires you to demonstrate that people were misled, or reasonably could be misled. So all generative AI does is mean that you know, if the quality of it is better and people are more likely to be misled, then you've got a stronger case, but you don't need new case law or new law for that.
Yeah, there's existing law. If I say somebody made me look like I said something false and it damaged my career or my relationships, well then yeah, I'd have a strong case if it really looked like me and hurt my life. You know? And the existing law covers that.
Yeah, and it's covered it for a very long time, because again, this isn't a new problem, and the new tools, I don't think, require us to create a new law around it, because the law already, again, kind of recognizes that something that's more believable is going to be more actionable in law, and something that's less believable and nobody believed it for a minute, it just, you know, like, you know, somebody circulate a picture of me with horns, like nobody thinks I'm actually a devil, like, you know, so the law already takes, I mean, maybe I am, you know, the law already takes into account things that I hear a lot of people say about generative AI, like it's so much more believable, people would believe it. But the law already takes that into account, so again, I don't think we need new law about that, but we just need, you know, people already have ability to do that. Sometimes new technology comes along and people rush to pass a new law for it, and I think at EFF, we always try to stop and think about what is, you know, like, is that really needed or not? Because, you know, sometimes it's not, and I think this is an area where it's really not needed. You know, there are some issues around AI training and also AI outputs. There might need to be some new law here, but I think that we should tread really carefully, because there's a lot of people who would like you know, there's a lot of people like President Trump or other public, Musk is one of these public figures who really want nobody to ever be able to reference them or use them without their permission, because they want to be able to sanitize anything they do. And we have to really be careful that we don't let scary stories move us off of the right balance between when we should let them do that and when we shouldn't.
Got a question here online. I'm going to forgive the room. I'm going to prioritize online because of the technical snafu. So one question,
Yeah.
I'll get back to the room. What kind of AI are you specifically worried about, and why?
I mean, as I said earlier, the stuff I'm most worried about is the stuff that governments are using to deny people bail, to deny them benefits, these kind of, I would say that the first thing I would think about is the AI trying to predict future human behavior? Because AIs, if that's what they're doing, and if the consequences to you or the people they're trying to predict is, you know, you lose your children to foster care, you don't get out of jail, you don't get the resources you need for, you know, you qualify for in the government. We've seen all of these things happen across the United States with, I mean, I'm not even sure they qualify as AIs, with machine learning systems being used, things like predictive policing, which is being used in a lot of places to try to predict who is likely to be a criminal. Those kinds of systems fail. They fail in really horrible biased ways because they double down on the bias. You know, if the police, some friends of ours at a group called Human Rights Data Analysis Group did some work, and they discovered that if the police are biased like 40% against a group, and you feed that into the general machine learning algorithms that the cops are using, the thing that spits out will be 60% biased against that group. Why? Because the AI is picking up patterns, and it doesn't just pick them up and replicate them, it picks them up and doubles down on them. Because that's what it thinks it's supposed to be doing. It doesn't think. That's what it's programmed to do. So I worry a lot about AIs being used to cover up bias in broken systems, or replicate bias, or even double down on it, and we're already have these problems all over the place. This is not a future problem, this is the current problem. I also think we should focus on current problems, and there's a lot of people worried about kind of really remote future doomsday ideas and spending a lot of money and a lot of energy on those things when there are problems right in front of us that with AIs that are deployed today and being sold today that we can and should address. We know the administration is trying to use AIs to decide who keeps their jobs in the government. Like, it's a really bad use of AI to do that kind of stuff. It makes mistakes. It makes the kinds of mistakes that are, some of them are predictable, but some of them aren't predictable. They don't make the same kind of mistakes humans do, and so we're still in the process of trying to figure out what those mistakes are. And so that's a really dangerous time to be doing things where people's lives or livelihoods or access to their children could be at stake. So those are the things that make me the most upset about AIs. I think that the generative AI copyright stuff is, I think that training up an AI on copyrighted material is fair use. There may be issues with what spits out of it, but I don't think it's copyright infringement to train an AI, and I think it would be a bad world in which we thought that in a lot of ways. And one of the reasons I think that is because copyright is a really blunt instrument. It doesn't have a lot of nuance in it. It is a strict liability with very, very high damages per copy. And I'm trying to apply that framework, which was written about a time when copying was hard and expensive, and that was the right time to monetize. Like, that's the wrong framework for thinking about the problems that might come with AI. Whether you're thinking about the training or the output, it's the wrong framework. And people are using it because it's a really, really powerful framework, but it doesn't strike the right balance for what society might want from AI versus what it doesn't want from AI.
It's funny we get into that because there's a follow-up online question that I think slots well into this, which I will also add something that was recently in my life that also seems relevant to this. So the direct question online is, I work with artists who use code in creative, out-of-the-box ways. Do you have any guiding questions that you like to ask to determine if there are potential harms of a project? And I think that question ties in very much to something I experienced recently, which is that it seems that there's a lot of people, especially a lot of young people, who seem absolutely convinced that using generative AI art in any way is inherently anti-artist and inherently unethical. Now, I agree with you. I think model training is fair use, and I think that's far too simplistic a view of generative AI art. Like, a lot of art, a lot of it is bad, but I've also seen some incredibly amazing creative stuff made with it too. But I'm curious what you might say to a young person who has just heard repeatedly in the news and other sources that this AI is bad, it's anti-artist, and while I agree it's fair use, there also though seems to be this kind of sense, I think similar to like what happens with data brokers, where I think there's kind of this feeling of like, okay, maybe it's fair use, but they still couldn't have made this tool that makes art like me without me as the input. Maybe it's not literally the exact bits and pixels, but I certainly feel for people who still feel viscerally like something has been stolen from them, even though I don't think copyright is the solution. What would you say to those people?
I mean, I think that's right. I think that I'm open to conversations about how to think about this. U.S. copyright law is not, it's not based on the idea that everything that you ever published can never be used by anybody else for any other reason. In fact, we all stand on the shoulders of giants. If you ask an artist, they will tell you honestly that they probably spent the early part of their career copying other artists and then developed their own voice, right? So I think there is a frame about art and how art works and how young artists develop that is a little off from my experience of art, that like, you know, science, you know, people have scientific breakthroughs not because they sit in a room all by themselves and they go eureka. It's because they're in conversation and playing with other artists and other scientists, and that's how science actually develops. This, like Einstein sitting in a barn somewhere and developing, you know, theories, or Newton with the apple falling in. Like, we have these models of how science and art happen that are wrong, I think, in terms of the reality. And I say that because I think that, you know, I think that this idea that this was mine and nobody should have ever taken it and done anything that I didn't approve of with it is something we ought to push a little hard back on, because that's actually not really the right frame for art or science. So that's kind of a frame for this. You know, I think for as many, I think that, you know, there are plenty and plenty of artists who are using AI. I interviewed one on how to fix, I've interviewed a couple on how to fix the internet. You know, people who can take this tool and do amazing and make beautiful work that is uniquely theirs using generative AI. There's a lot of them. I think the way to think about it, if you're a coder or you're somebody doing this, is, are you using this as a tool to express yourself? You know, how are you developing your prompts? How are you going back and forth with the work to try to make it your vision, what you see? Or are you using it just to make something that looks like somebody else? And if you're in the first category, a generative AI system can be an amazing tool. You can do a lot of the grunt work about doing other things in the same way you can as a coder. And let the AI do that piece and you do the creative piece and build it. But the question you have to ask yourself is, are you building your own vision, or are you copying somebody else's? And if you're copying somebody else's, then you can end up in plagiarism, and you can end up in situations in which you're basically ripping somebody off. But it's not the AI, it's you. What are you doing? I think is the way to start with that. And if what you're doing is plagiarizing, then you should be liable for that. You should be responsible for that. Just like any other, it's not okay. But I think that there is a tendency sometimes to want to blame the technology rather than the people.
Yeah, almost equivalent to blaming me for violating copyright because I used a synthesizer to play somebody else's song instead of my own song.
Right, and synthesizers can be used to do both, right? And or when hip hop first started, you know, there was this whole sense that this was copyright infringement, right? Because people were building songs out of pieces of other people's songs. And there's some bad copyright rulings that, like, only 3 notes of a flute solo in a Beastie Boys song had to be paid for. You know, this is a bad ruling, right? And we should not replicate this with AI. AI is a tool that can help us express ourselves better. Just like I wouldn't want to live in a world where you couldn't scratch off pieces of old Sam Cooke songs and make a cool new hip hop song. That doesn't mean we don't figure out how to compensate people. But again, copyright means you cannot do it unless you pay every single person, which means that lots of art wouldn't happen. Collage wouldn't happen. And I don't think we want to adopt that rule. I think we want to think about how do we do it. But if you have to pay every single person for every single piece that goes into a generative AI system, I'll tell you what that means. It means OpenAI and another big company are going to have the only AIs. We'll never have public AIs. We won't have Hugging Face or any of the public versions of AIs. And again, you also have to think about the implications of the rule that you're trying to articulate and what that means. That means rich people are the only ones who can develop these kinds of systems. And I don't think I want to live in that world. So those are the kinds of things that I would think about on the artistic general AI thing side. Again, this is the part that's sucking all the air out of the room. I really, really urge you to think about AI as not just being about Scarlett Johansson and instead being about a whole suite of systems. I had somebody named Arvind Narayan, and he's a Princeton professor, on my podcast recently, and I don't think this episode's out, I think it'll be out in the next couple of weeks. And he said, one of the things about AI is that people are talking about AI as if you were trying to make a decision about whether you liked vehicles or not, or whether food was good, right? Like, at that level of generality, you can't make any good decisions, right? You have to ask, who's doing it, what are they doing, and why are they doing? And then liability schemes, we might need a new liability scheme, but I would say 90% of the things that people are concerned about, we can find answers to in current liability schemes. And most of that has to do with plagiarism, false light, defamation, you know, those kinds of doctrines, which are old doctrines, are, you know, what was that? There's an old quote from Ecclesiastes that I used to use, right? You know, there's nothing new under the sun.
One of my favorite quotes.
Yeah, I mean, human behavior is human behavior. They might have the coolest tools in the world, but they're going to use it to do the same old shit, right? What do we do about porn? What do we do about plagiarism?
What do we do about them kids these days getting dangerous ideas, corrupting the youth?
I mean, it's funny because when you mention kids, in my experience, lots and lots of kids are using generative AI. They're just feeling bad about it. They're not using it.
Without betraying certain people's privacy, I'll just say that this came up in the context of students being given an assignment encouraging them to learn to be creative with generative AI, and multiple students literally wanted to opt out of the assignment, having ethical objections to using generative AI in any capacity. So I was just very fascinated by that.
I think it's fascinating, and I do think that it's reasonable to say, look, I don't want to participate in this. Like, nobody wants to, if you don't want to use a computer because you really don't like the politics of the people who build computers, like,
Fair.
go. I'm telling you, I sued an oil company for 10 years for human rights violations. I feel guilty every time I fill up my tank because I'm participating in that. Like, you can, those are fair and reasonable decisions to make, but I don't think that they're the ones that society as a whole are going to ultimately make. These tools have the potential to provide too much, and what we really have to think about is, how do we spread the spoils of this as broadly as possible? How do we make sure there's a market, or whatever we want to say, that there's public AI, that there are AIs that are not locked up in corporate control, and that we don't create a set of rules such that the only people who can build them or offer them to the public are rich people. Because Facebook already built, it's not even they already built, they're going to be able to weather any kind of regulatory limit. And what that's going to mean is we're not going to have a public version of AI, or we're not going to have a nonprofit version of an AI. But the big corporate guys are going to lock all of this up, and I think that's a worse world for all of us.
So I know I have one question for you online and then one in the room here. The question online was, so the question specifically is about how whether anything derived from copyright material as fair use should be legally open source as fair use, or specifically, I'm trying to paraphrase the question, but anything generated by AI should be free to everyone, question mark.
I mean, I'm not sure that, I think that rule wouldn't get you where you wanted to go. I mean, I am very supportive of free and open source. I think public AI is really important. I would like, an artist who's using AI to develop their art to be able to exercise a regular license over what they create. I don't think I'd want to say that anything created by an AI cannot have any kind of protection at all and ought to be, done in the public domain. I mean, I'd have to think about it. I'm a big fan of the public domain. I think the world would be better off if it wasn't such a tiny little exception to how we do things and instead was much bigger. But I'm not sure, because AI generated it, is the right rule for that. But I have to think about it.
Yeah, I just to put a beat in your on it, one thing I've heard proposed by a tech lawyer here in Austin who used to be on our board, he proposed the framework that you can't copyright the outputs of generative AI,
Yes.
but that you could potentially copyright a sufficiently detailed prompt because you made that.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. You know, I think that's not crazy. I mean, I know there was something in the Authors Guild, the Writers Guild contract around AI and copyright that was good, and I'm not remembering it right now. But you know, again, I'm thinking of the artists who are using AI to create their arts, and how much do we want to sideswipe them because we're uncomfortable with AIs? I'm not sure.
I mean,
You know,
people who
people-
play synthesizers still get paid, so we don't necessarily want to say
Yeah.
people who make AI art have no way to make money. So I
Yeah.
hear your dilemma.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would like to reform copyright law in a bunch of ways, but I'm not sure this is the way I would start. You know, I mean, there could be some version of a CC license, that a Creative Commons license that might be a little more flexible than copyright, but again, I'm not sure that's the right way to go. I mean, you know, there's a bunch of questions about authorship and who should be called the author of something that's written by AI. And as I said, I'm not as up on it as my IP team, so I'm a little hesitant to venture because they've been thinking about it a lot more deeply than I am. So watch our blog, because Corinne McSherry or Kit Walsh or some of the EFF folks, we've been writing a lot of briefs in these cases, and I know they've been thinking about this, so that might be where you go rather than me, because I just kind of play in IP. As I said, I'm a mile wide and an inch deep, and we're getting a little deeper than I am.
Well, similar but different tactics, just the person online who asked one of the questions, reframing their question a little bit, so maybe I'll get a little more of what she was hoping you would answer this time, asking, do you have any food for thought type of questions you might suggest to artists who are making projects using webcam feeds or other user input regarding data privacy and ethics?
Well, I have one strong rule at EFF that I use, which is don't violate people's privacy in order to demonstrate that people's privacy can be violated. Don't make don't make anybody a victim again. They're already a victim from a bad system, and you using them as an example of how bad the system is just hurts them a second time. So it's kind of a first do no harm kind of situation. So I think the first thing you should think about is, who's in this webcam? What are you doing? Who's going to be impacted by this? You know, if it's a closed system and it's just you and you're trying to demonstrate, or people who are working with you and in on the thing, then sure, you can use those kinds of things to demonstrate the risks. But I really don't like harming innocent people as a way to make my point. And if you care about privacy, you should care about not violating people's privacy, period. That's just how it goes. And we get, you know, we do a lot of coders' rights work here. We advise a lot of people who are thinking about this, and this is something that I think sometimes people fall the trap of thinking that if I just show you how bad it is and how hurt you are, you'll side with me about making the change. And I just don't think you want to make the people who you're trying to protect collateral damage of making your point.
I've been told by the person online that they loved your answer, so I think
Well, good.
I know we have somebody back here.
Clip it and use it. I say it inside EFF all the time.
Yeah, Owen, if you want to come up so you can be seen, yeah. Actually, we have a few in-ring questions, but as I said, payments to the online people for not being able to hear the first 20 minutes.
Hello again, Cindy.
Hi.
Hi, so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about state level AI regulations, and that we now will have a 10-year moratorium because of the bill that passed last week, and also the, here in Texas.
It got out of the bill.
They took it out.
They took it out.
In the Texas 149.
Wait, which, sorry, I was saying, what
Oh,
was
the
it?
state. The state
Yeah,
has a
there's a 10-year moratorium.
Oh, well, that got took out of the federal.
That got taken
That's
out,
not
okay.
happening. Yes.
That's right.
Yes,
So-
a little bit of good news. Actually, it got voted down 99-1. Only Ted Cruz voted for it.
Classic.
Yeah.
So here in Texas, the governor signed, the Texas Responsible Artificial Intelligence Governance Act, and it's gonna go into effect in January. I'm wondering if you thought about state level AI regs, since it's not gonna be happening at the federal level.
Yeah, I mean, yes, EFFers have been working a lot on state level AI regs, and I don't wanna get ahead of my skis about where we are on things. I know that we have, opposed a couple, and we've supported some others, and I really can't tell you which. If you look at we've done more in California than other places, and we were standing with things. I mean, I think some of the state level AI regulations are good ideas, and some of them are horrible ideas, right? Some of them are driven by the the content industry just wanting to get paid again and again and again, and I don't think that's a very good thing. Others are better. It kind of depends on the thing.
Did you see the Texas one that passed?
I didn't. I'm afraid I didn't. My team probably did though.
Ted likes it.
I mean, well, so they almost put a very bad provision in it that would have meant I would have had to come out guns blazing against it, because they almost had something in it that was going to run afoul of Moody v. Net Choice and was just going to get instantly shot down by the Supreme Court. They took that out, thank God. I think my reaction to the bill is there's nothing, and I look forward to when your team gets around to it. My initial reaction was there was nothing hugely objectionable in it, and I think the sentiments are in the right place. The concern is just whether it's actually pretty words or whether it's actually enforceable, because Texas is allergic to private rights of action. So much like the data privacy bill here in Texas, there is no private right of action. So whether our rights with this bill can actually be enforced remain to be seen. It also, it's better than what we had, which was no law. I also thought some earlier versions of the bill were a little bit stronger on regulating private actors and not just government entities, which is good, but AI harms can come from both. So I think the answer is sort of like, is it bad? In the sense of, is it better than what we had? It's good. Do I think we need to go farther? I would also say so, but I'm also well aware that Rep. Capriglione got immense industry pushback just to pass the weakened down version he did. So, there's also the don't let the perfect be the enemy of the possible.
Yeah, I think I just did a quick search in my internal team, and they basically said, Stein, the Texas Responsible AI Government Act, is that the one you're talking about?
Probably, that's the big one here.
Yeah. And he basically, I think the one thing that people were worried a little bit about is that it's preempting local ordinances, right?
Which I don't like either, but
Yeah.
And the feds were about to do that to Texas, so,
Yeah, I think that was, but we didn't have a position on it. I think because, just exactly the reasons Kevin's saying is that, it wasn't awful, but it wasn't great, and so we didn't take a position on it, so.
Yeah, as I said, they did have a clause in there, about banning AI viewpoint discrimination, which was gonna immediately run foul of Moody v. Net Choice, so, I would have been against if that made it in, but it didn't, so yay.
There was trying to balance, wanting innovation, AI innovation to happen in Texas, pro-business, pro-innovation, but also have some civil liberties constraints in there. They put a Texas AI Council together, which, who knows what that will get done.
I tried to encourage them to say it couldn't all just be industry, that we needed some academics and activists on it too. That change never made it in, of course.
We had a little work group that was kind of chewing it over. We can send y'all, what we think about it, and forward that to your people, just as our opinion.
I'd be happy to, yeah, Haley Tsukiyama and the crew, and Kevin knows them as well, like
Haley's great.
my
last time I was in San Fran,
Yeah, my state ledge team is awesome, and because it's so awesome, I just sit back and listen to their reports about what they're doing, rather than knowing very much about it, so.
Thanks.
All right, I'm gonna do one more in room, and then I have another one online. Who wanted to go? Yeah. Anyone come up top? I'm so happy we fixed the audio. My panic level has just dropped immensely.
So, I had a question, and I guess it's somewhat tied to free speech, mostly data and data privacy. And so, one of the changes that I think we can maybe expect is the very definition of what privacy around data is and privacy protection around data. So with prompts and with long context windows and with long AI conversations and that type of data. So the fear here is obviously that there is a possibility of leakage, like data leakage of not only you get fragmented data and you may or may combine it with some metadata, you might be able to reconstruct that person. Now if you have completely redacted, no PII, no metadata, nothing whatsoever, we have a conversation. So that basically the context of the prompt and the conversation, the leakage of that can, the story is idiosyncratic enough that if it comes into the wrong hands or gets leaked out, or even if it gets post-trained on that particular data, that can be identified potentially at first. So the question, one of the questions I guess I have in that context is that recent lawsuit between New York Times and OpenAI, where now OpenAI is asked to store user data indefinitely, and just the existence of that data, also knowing that a lot of people are not necessarily familiar with how AI models are trained, how data is stored. They're opening up a lot of very private information, which they may think that they protected themselves if they don't share anything specific, and also they might think that when they delete it, now everything is forgotten. So I'm just wondering from a GDPR type of perspective, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, we've been watching that, and my colleague Cara has been watching it really closely, and I think they just unsealed the piece of the order, so we just saw, but some is still redacted. So we were quite concerned about the potential that all this information that OpenAI was going to share was going to end up being really privacy invasive for the people who use the tool. And I think you're exactly right that people do not think that of this as a company that they're talking to that's going to see. We had a hard enough time convincing people that when they were on Facebook, there's a company that's listening, that's paying attention to everything they're doing. When you get that chat interface, people really lose that ability to think about the privacy implications of the conversations they're having. And we're increasingly seeing people who are treating ChatGPT as kind of their little personal assistant that they share everything with, including very, very intimate details of their lives. So we're quite concerned about that. I don't think we've yet made a decision about whether we're going to weigh in on that, or even whether we can, given kind of where it is procedurally. But yeah, this is something we're really, it's a hard problem, right? Because the plaintiffs need to know enough about how people are using this tool to be able to make their case. Whether I agree or disagree with the New York Times, I get it as a litigator. Like, if you're going to make your case that this is being used to infringe your copyrights, you need to be able to see how it's actually being used and whether your copyrights are being infringed in the way the thing is working. On the other hand, this is a horrible thing for privacy that this is doing. I don't think the GDPR will come in very much because it'll be a court order for preservation, which the GDPR doesn't really speak to. You get a court order saying you have to do something in the context of litigation. I don't know chapter and verse of the GDPR, but I'm pretty sure there's space for both on the criminal side and the civil side for variations to accommodate the legal systems, right? Again, I don't know chapter and verse on that, but I would be shocked. I know on the criminal side, the GDPR isn't going to reach it. And so the question is whether in the U.S. civil context, but so OpenAI probably doesn't have an argument that the GDPR won't let it follow a court order like this. Again, it's narrow, not narrow in the, there's a lot of people impacted, but narrow in terms of it's just about this litigation and it's for a limited time. And they can't use it for anything. I'm sure there is a protective order in place that says they can't use it for anything but the litigation. They can't just turn around and publish it. So I don't know that again, governor won't have much to say about it. It's really more having a conversation with the judge about the implications and the people that you're sideswiping along the way to this discovery fight.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right, as I said, I'm going to do another one online here before we go back to the room. Okay, I have that. Let's see. I'm being asked to ask you, what do you think about the current balance between big tech wanting to reduce government regulation versus keeping our IP rights? Should we give big tech more freedom to develop better AI, or should we want regulators to provide us with better protection?
I mean, it's not an either or. It's not a black and white thing. I mean, good regulation can foster the development of other AI, of more AI. Bad regulation can ensconce the current 4 companies, and not let anybody else play. So sadly, the regulation good, regulation bad question doesn't actually help us get to a better world. And I know that's frustrating because it'd be nice if you could decide that a better world would happen with or without regulation, and there are prominent people in the Department of Government Efficiency who think that, but I don't, and I don't think anybody looking at this. You have to have no regulation means that the giants will dominate and crush competition. Too much regulation will crush new entrants as well, or other entrants will stop innovation. You have to do it, I hate to be, the 3 bears about it, but you have to get it just right in order to really do this. And I'll give you an example. The home internet revolution was made possible because the FCC issued a regulation that told AT&T, the monopolist at the time for telecommunications, that they had to let people plug something other than AT&T owned and licensed phones into the walls, right? Because AT&T wanted a rule that you could only, actually had a rule that you could only plug your phones, and there was a fight in the FCC, and the FCC regulated and said, AT&T, you have to let people plug modems into the wall, not just phones. That's why we got the home internet revolution. If we had said no regulation ever, we don't want to harm innovation, we would have one telephone company that would control all of the internet now. There's just no way that it would develop. Similarly, we have Google because Microsoft was being investigated by the Department of Justice for monopolizing the market for operating systems, and Google browsers, and Google came out and survived because of that investigation. So but if you have too much regulation, say the FCC issues a broadcast flag that says anybody who wants to do a broadcast has to put a flag in it, so that and everybody who's going to create a device that could listen to streams of any kind had to have it had to be built so that it followed a flag, and if the flag said no copying or no streaming or no translations, or you can only show this in certain countries, all those kind of broadcast flags, you would have to abide by it. That's a regulation that hurt innovation, right? So you have to get it right, and that means sometimes you regulate, sometimes you don't, and that means you have to look very closely at how you regulate and why. But I would argue that we're in a time of the dominance of the tech giants right now because we stopped regulating in the area of anti-competitive competition. And we need more regulation in the context of fostering markets and requiring competition, and maybe less regulation in terms of things like, you can't say anything that the governor doesn't like on your platform.
Before I go back to the room and ask another question, I have a particular question I'd like to ask, and I think it very much ties into the original reason we asked you here to talk about, your famous Supreme Court case, because I find myself thinking.
I have to correct you, Kevin, we didn't make it to the Supreme Court because the government backed down at the Ninth Circuit, so I did not argue the case.
Look at you being, you're a lawyer to the end, technically correct.
You get a special pen if you argue at the Supreme Court, I never got that.
But frankly, it's still, all of us are in this group thanks to your efforts. I use end-to-end encryption every day. But to that end, I'm wondering how you see free speech rights over AI models shaping up here in terms of case law, and whether you see the First Amendment rights you won for code just blanket applying in the case of AI, much like it did for encryption, and that those protections stand, or whether you see some differences that we may have to relitigate. Because particularly, I, like you, think so many of the problems of AI will be resolved. I mean, it's truly easy for people to self-host their own models on their own devices, and not a nightmare where even a highly trained person like myself could spend weeks figuring it out. But the thing is as we all know, to sometimes our amusement and sometimes infinite frustration, commercial AI offerings, sometimes from a good sense of ethics and sometimes from cowardice, there's a lot of censorship on what you can talk about them. And you'll get different censorship with different models. Like, I always laugh at this idea that you could somehow build one of these things without bias. They have bias by definition. But different models have biases, but there's a lot of off-limits topics, as anybody knows who's tried to talk with them. Obviously, with a self-hosted model, you can run it without guardrails. And I wonder about the immense free speech implications of what the authorities might do when we're living in that world. Because let's just say that, even with the guardrails versions, maybe I've gotten ChatGPT to tell me the chemical formulas for certain things that are technically illegal via exploiting it that they didn't really want me to know. There's a lot of forbidden knowledge that's technically protected by the First Amendment, but that people who know how to do it, how it works, they keep it secret. And I'm curious, what do we do when we have guardrails-less AI models all running on our own devices, potentially telling ordinary people how to make quite dangerous things? How do you see the government responding to the First Amendment implications of running models that might provide very dangerous information?
Well, again, I think that you will see the level of First Amendment scrutiny match the harm and how the government tries to regulate it. So I do think that just because something is protected by the First Amendment doesn't mean that the government can't regulate it. It's gonna, but a regulation that says an AI model, can't, that you can have liability if you release and run an AI model that tells people how to build a chemical weapon. That's actually not illegal. There's very little that's illegal. It would be obscenity, maybe. There's not a lot on the, even the instructions for building a nuclear bomb case didn't get very far. So it's hard to think of something that is speech, but if we start with something that's not speech, obscenity, that, trying to stop obscenity is a legitimate thing. The government gets to regulate in this area, and the question is, are they just stopping regulating obscenity, or are they reaching more broadly? And how does that law work, and how is it working in practice? It may pass muster if the only thing that the law prevents is obscenity from being spit out, or child sexual abuse material being spit out from an AI. That might pass First Amendment muster. I still think the First Amendment is the right frame for it, because there's so much speech. It's so easy. It's so much of what's going on here is speech, that I think to try to take it out of the First Amendment framework would end up with overbroad regulation immediately, and you'd end up with a law that says you can't have any speech that's that might harm children come out of an AI, and that can't be the case, because adults can use AI too, and they should have access to materials that are not suitable for children, right? So I think that your AI always has to spit out answers in English because we're an English first country, right? Like, that's just gonna be about speech, right? So much of what's going on in AI is about speech. That's the output of it, and whether it's, you know, talking to you physically or you're reading it or whatever, but it's a chat box, it's a speechy thing that's happening. So I think it has to start in the First Amendment box. That doesn't mean it's game over for regulation, but it means that the rules have to be carefully sculpted.
I know we had at least, I think, a few more questions in the room. I've seen people floating up hands throughout the talk. I want to make sure I get to those. Yeah, you have a question?
Yeah, go up there.
Yeah, it's just easier if you go. Yeah. Maybe you might be seeing better in that row, I don't know. But hearing's supposed to, those are the mics on the table there, so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
Got a podcast I'd love to have you on, but anyway, could you comment on some of the crypto coding court cases like Samurai Wallet, Bitcoin Fog, Roman Stormov, and some of these other people? And one thing also remember, say their names, but yeah. I wanted to get your take on those.
So EFF has participated in a couple of them, and some others we haven't. We participated in the Storm case. Most recently, we wrote an amicus brief in the Storm case, kind of based on the decision that came out of the, oh my goodness, the Mixer, Tornado Cash. Yeah, we participated, there's a couple of Mixers, but it was the Tornado Cash case. You know, the thing that we've tried to weigh in to really, you know, talk about is this code of speech argument, right? That, you know, there may be things illegal that are happening through these mixers. I don't doubt the government's argument that the North Korea, in the context of Tornado Cash, that the North Koreans were money laundering through the mixer. I don't know enough about it to know whether it's true or not, but I don't want to do that. I don't think that there's reason to doubt that this tool has been misused by bad guys, or by the U.S.'s enemies. But I do worry about the response that we've seen. I mean, again, the Trump administration is taking a very different tack, and we'll see what happens in these cases with that. But before that, the Justice Department was really taking, and the OFAC, the sanctions folks, were taking a very, very broad view of liability here in ways that we worried threatened this coded speech argument, this coders, right? You know, if you, and we wrote a brief that got cited by the judge in the Tornado Cash case about, you know, how you shouldn't be able to reach just, you know, regular coders who weren't using the system, who were building the system, and we don't want to discourage this. And the reason was, of course, in the Tornado Cash case, when the OFAC sanctions, I don't know how much your audience knows about this, but a mixer is a way that you can use the Ethereum blockchain to help hide your financial transactions, because otherwise it's all very public.
It makes it more anonymous the way, say, a privacy coin like Monero is in non-private coins like Ethereum.
Yeah, well, it's like 50 people put a dollar bill into a bowl, and then they come back later and pull the dollar bill out of the bowl. They probably aren't going to pull out the same dollar bill.
Right, and I mean, Monero uses ring cycles built into the protocol, so it's kind of bolting that on to the ones that don't have it.
There are different ways to do this, but the idea is to give people some privacy in their financial transactions that the blockchain, whichever blockchain you're using, doesn't otherwise provide. And we think that being able to have financial privacy is an important value. But other people were arguing that part very strongly, and we felt like what we could best do was to stand up for the open source community that is developing so many of these tools, because the first thing that happened after OFAC sanctioned Tornado Cash, and OFAC put on the sanctions list a piece of code. Sanctions lists are like, you know, normally they're about people. You put Osama bin Laden on the sanctions list, or maybe somebody who does this, but the idea that a piece of code would be on the sanctions list is highly problematic. And what it meant was GitHub took down the code repository because they could be responsible responsible for hosting a sanctioned entity. And so the first thing we did was we wrote a letter to OFAC and said, this is crazy and it's causing this chilling effect already that we're seeing because GitHub's taking down their repositories, which means the regular old coders who are just helping develop the science for a thing that's important to exist, are being, unable to develop it. And even before the case kind of went to court, the government backed down and issued a kind of a FAQ, which we really wanted them to issue official guidance, but they issued an FAQ and said, oh, we didn't mean the open source coders. And so as a result of that, GitHub put it back up again. So by the time the thing went to court, we kind of won the kind of first thing that we were most interested in, which was protecting science. Again, code of speech, protecting the science. But we did file a brief in the Tornado Cash, and we did get the court in the lower level to say, that line was a line that should be, what happened when it went on appeal is that the court actually embraced the much bigger argument, which is you can't put a piece of code on the sanctions list, which was great, because I think that was right. And then Roman Storm, who's one of the creators of the Tornado Cash software, is being prosecuted separately in New York. And he's being prosecuted for developing it and for using it, although it's very opaque. It's really hard to tell what piece of it. The government's kind of lumped it all in together. And in the Netherlands, it's worse. One of the other creators of Tornado Cash is in the Netherlands, and we never even saw an unsealed indictment to see why the guy was arrested. They have a much more opaque process than even we have, and ours is not great. So we filed an amicus brief saying that, we thought that the Fifth Circuit Court in Texas was right, that you can't put a piece of code on the sanctions list, and once you take the piece of code out of it, there should be nothing left to prosecute Storm about. And the court disagreed. What the court said was that prosecuting Storm for other things that he did, not just the code and publishing the code. So even if you pull the code out of it, there's still other things that they're prosecuting him for, and that's enough for the prosecution to go forward. So we'll see what happens from there, and we're watching closely, but that's kind of been our participation, and we felt like that was a really good, strong place for us to stand. There's plenty of money in the crypto industry. People are making a bunch of the other arguments. Sometimes we make a decision about where we're going to weigh in based on, what else needs to be said that's not being said by the people with money. And this seemed like that was being said. But we're watching these cases, but also watching for places where we can be value added as opposed to just Me Too on some of the arguments that are being made. So the Samurai Wallet guys, I may be misremembering, they had a harder factual story because they were like giving out merch about money laundering and stuff that was not great. Like if you're gonna do something that's legally problematic, go see your lawyer first and let them help you not give the government easy arguments that you're intentionally trying to buy. I might be wrong. There's a bunch of these cases, and so I apologize if I'm wrong.
I mean, you'd be surprised how many people have asked me about potentially illegal things on Facebook Messenger, and I'm just like, well, first mistake, you're not messaging me on Signal, so I'm not sure you know what you're doing.
I agree. The guy that you used, his name is Alexi Percev, so.
Yeah. Anyway, so we're watching some of these, and we'll probably weigh in this area where we feel like we have a unique voice. But that's, I think that, we'll see. It'll be very interesting to see what, the Trump administration hasn't yet moved on Storm, but they've moved on a lot of other people, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with some of these other cases now that the administration has changed its tune so much from the prior administration about cryptocurrency and these things. I mean, I don't don't know where they're gonna come down. I think financial privacy is really important, and one of the exciting things about cryptocurrency is the chance to try to build in some financial privacy. What I find sometimes though is that people who aren't in government really want financial privacy, and then once they get in government, they want to be able to find all the people they're mad at, and they become less supportive of privacy across the board than they were when they were trying to get into office. We'll see if this administration is the same.
Well, it seems like it's, you know, somebody prosecuting Canon because they used a camera to make child porn. I mean, it's, and by the way, say hi to your little friend there.
Oh, the dog. The dog.
Did you see the dog?
Yes, yes.
Well, so the picture behind me is of my dog, but the actual two dogs are in the, I don't know if you saw them.
Yeah, no, we've seen them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're patiently waiting for their
So,
dinner.
yeah, I was gonna say, Cindy, are you working late just on our behalf, or you need to be there?
I am, I had a window to drive home, Kevin, it's not your fault, and then I had a meeting get slotted in right before we did it, and so I missed my window to get home, so my dogs are being very patient.
Well, I think, you know, we are almost out of time on our end. I think I will see if we have any, we might have time for one, maybe two more questions. So, who has not yet heard their question from Cindy answered and would love to get, EFF's weighing in on whatever, you know, but especially code-to-speech issues. Has anybody not gotten a chance to talk yet or really wants to? And it's fine if we've already gone over so much that you don't have many more burning ones. I maybe then, if nobody else has one, I will try to think of a good one to close us out on. Oh, well, actually, all right, one question and then mine. Let me pretend to think of it. Yeah.
Thank you, Cindy. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. Just before Texas, we touched on it briefly, but the 3D printed gun, I mean, that's kind of the newest iteration of code-to-speech, I guess, the modern one. It's in Texas. Kind of what happened with that, and what are we, what's the status of that?
And I guess more broadly, speech when it comes to making physical objects.
yeah, I mean, this is one where I think the first Trump administration dropped the prosecution of Cody Wilson, if I remember right, and I apologize, I'm not remembering. Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, I think that that we're right, that like the instructions, you know, the instructions aren't the same as the thing, and they should, oh hi, are you hungry? He knew I was talking about it, so he showed up. So I don't know the exact status anymore. I know the prosecution is over, and I don't think that, I think that it's good. I'm sorry. Hey, go in now, go in now. No. He was very patient for a long time. He's my puppy. He's 13 months old, and he's 105 pounds.
I remember when mine was that age.
Yeah, he's being pretty good, honestly, but he's ready. You know, I think that we filed a brief in that case, both in the lower courts and the Court of Appeals, that code of speech, and that means that the government has to heed a 5R. Again, I'm not sure, you know, if this is another situation in which it was a licensing scheme. And so I think we were right that it was a prior restraint on the licensing scheme was a prior restraint on speech, and it had to meet the tight rules of prior restraints, and it didn't meet it. That doesn't mean that you can't regulate 3D printed guns. It just means you have to regulate the gun, and you know that'll fall under gun regulation, which is, you know, it's complicated other things. But the instructions for how to build it are just the instructions for how to build it, and they're just the fact that you can feed that into a machine and get a gun faster than hand it to a silversmith and have the silversmith build it for you shouldn't be the difference between whether something's protected or not. And that was basically the position we took in the brief. My memory is that the prosecution got dropped because of the first Trump administration coming in, but I may be misremembering.
Alright. Let's see if we have no final questions. Well, I may, as is my wont, I may make the final question a little philosophical, but I figure if anybody would have an interesting answer, it might be. Computer code is speech. Do you see any ways that computer code, despite being speech, do you see ways that it as a medium of speech, you know, as compared to a book or literally speaking or any other means of speaking in whatever mediums, do you see things that are especially unique about the way code functions as speech and maybe even special in a way? And I guess I'm sort of saying, like, what would your pitch be for why it's especially important that we treat code as speech and protect it? Are there some unique things we get from this kind of speech that we don't get from any other kind of speech?
I don't think so. But
That's
I
a fine
think we get
answer.
I think we get a lot of the same things, right? I mean, I think that science develops through code these days. Most, very, very many scientific ideas are expressed and developed and refined through code. Code is the language of a whole piece of science now. It kind of always was. I mean, you know, a lot of code is, just like mathematical symbols are a language that are really good for expressing certain kinds of ideas. I think code is very good at expressing certain kinds of ideas. And again, I learned this from Hal Abelson at MIT. It's a particularly good mechanism for talking about how to do things.
And it's so funny because you mentioned Hal Abelson, and I've never met him, but I have met Gerald Sussman. So, small world.
Yeah. So I think so I don't know that it's uniquely special or better than other kinds of speech, but it is good at a particular kind of thing, the way that other kinds of things are good at other things, right? I would argue that poetry is one of